Sing for me, and I'll take you and your little mama out of poverty.
She pulled out 9 crisp $1,000 bills, fanned them in the air, and said it loud enough for every person in that ballroom to hear. Sing for me, and I'll take you and your little mama out of poverty. The room went quiet. 200 of Chicago's most powerful people were watching, and the young woman standing in the center of that silence, the one in the plain black uniform, the one with her mother's hands and her father's pride, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at that woman, took one slow breath, and opened her mouth. Nobody in that room was ready for what came next. Before we go further, welcome to Morel Folktales. If stories like this one keep you up at night in the best way, this is exactly the kind of channel you want to be part of. Hit subscribe, tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the story. Her name was Camille, 25 years old, the daughter of Dorothy, who had worked as the head housekeeper in the Hargrove estate for over 20 years. Camille had grown up in that house, not as a guest, not as family, but close enough to both that she'd learned exactly where the line was drawn. She knew which forks went on which side of the plate. She knew that the crystal on the third shelf was from the 1940s and couldn't go in the dishwasher. She knew that Mr. Hargrove Sr. took his coffee black with no sugar, that he liked Coltrane on Sunday mornings, and that he had once slipped a college brochure under her mother's door with a handwritten note that said, "For Camille, if she wants it." She had wanted it. She'd gone to DePaul University on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs on the side, and graduated with a degree in vocal performance. She came back to Chicago not because she had to, but because her mother had been diagnosed with early-stage rheumatoid arthritis and the work at the estate was getting harder. Camille had told herself it was just for a year. That was 3 years ago. She wasn't bitter about it. That's the thing people never understood about Camille. She wasn't walking around with fire in her chest. She helped her mother with the heavy work. She kept singing at a small South Side church on Sundays, and she saved what little she could. She had a voice that her choir director used to say stopped conversations and started them at the same time, but she never pushed it in people's faces. She was the kind of woman who knew what she had and kept it close. That restraint was not weakness. It would eventually become her most powerful thing. Derek Hargrove was 38, the only son of Douglas Hargrove, who had built Hargrove Capital Group out of a single real estate investment in Atlanta in 1987 and turned it into one of the most respected black-owned financial firms in the country. Douglas was 71 now, stepping back, and Derek had taken the reins quietly and without drama. He was not his father in personality. Douglas was loud, warm, the kind of man who remembered everybody's name and their kids' names too. Derek was measured. He didn't say things he didn't mean, and he didn't mean things he hadn't thought through twice. He had inherited his father's discipline, but not his ease. People respected Derek. Not everyone liked him. He was fine with that ratio. He had been engaged to Vanessa Cole for 14 months. Vanessa was 34, the daughter of a prominent Atlanta attorney, educated at Georgetown, polished in a way that seemed engineered from birth. She was beautiful in a way that photographs couldn't fully hold, and she was smart enough to know how to use every room she walked into. She had met Derek at a charity gala, pursued him with the kind of focused patience that people who grow up around money develop early, and when he proposed, she had accepted in front of 40 witnesses and made sure the photo ended up in 3 publications. Their engagement was a social event before it was a personal one. Derek had told himself that was fine. That was how things worked at this level. He had talked himself into that position for over a year. The engagement dinner was his mother's idea. Loretta Hargrove had planned the whole thing. 200 guests at the Hargrove family's Kenwood estate, a full catering team, a jazz quartet, flowers that had been flown in from Miami. It was the kind of event that announced to Chicago's black elite that this family was solid, this union was real, and the next generation of Hargroves was locked in. Derek had approved the plan and then buried himself in work, the way he always did when something made him quietly uncomfortable and he didn't yet want to name why. Camille and Dorothy had both been asked to work the dinner. Dorothy had hesitated because Dorothy knew Vanessa, and Dorothy had spent 20 years learning to read the energy of a room before she walked into it. But they needed the overtime, and Douglas Hargrove had personally asked Dorothy to be there because she knew how the house ran better than anyone on the catering staff. So they went. Camille wore the standard black uniform, black blouse, black slacks, hair pulled back clean. She carried trays, refilled glasses, moved through the room the way she'd been trained to since she was a teenager helping her mother on holiday weekends. She kept her head down. She knew the rule, not because anyone had to tell her, but because she had been in enough rooms like this to know that invisibility was a form of self-protection. She was fine with it. She carried the tray, she smiled when smiled at, and she listened to the conversations around her the way she always did, not to gossip, but because she had spent her whole life learning things by paying attention. Vanessa noticed her around 9 o'clock. It started small. Vanessa was standing near the grand piano at the far end of the ballroom with a group of her friends, 3 women who had flown in from Atlanta and D.C., all dressed like the evening was a competition. One of them had made a comment about the jazz quartet, something about how the music felt dated. Vanessa had laughed and said she would have preferred something live and unexpected. And then her eyes had found Camille, who was clearing glasses from a nearby table. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Not rage, not dislike, something colder. Amusement. Dorothy's daughter, she said, just loud enough for her circle to hear. She went to school for music, didn't she? One of her friends raised an eyebrow. Vanessa picked up her champagne, walked the few steps over, and stood directly in Camille's path. Camille, right? She said. Her voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was the dangerous part. Camille stopped, looked up, and said yes. Vanessa smiled. I hear you sing. Camille said that she did. At church, nothing serious. Vanessa tilted her head. Well, tonight is a special night. I think we should have a little fun. She raised her voice then, and this is the part that made the room shift. She didn't lower it. She raised it. She wanted an audience, and she got one. Everyone, Vanessa said, half turning to the room. I want to do something a little different. The jazz quartet stopped. Heads turned. 200 people who had been in their own conversations found themselves looking at the center of the ballroom, where Vanessa Cole was standing next to a young woman in a server's uniform. This is Camille, Vanessa continued. She studied vocal performance in college. Full degree. And now she's here serving drinks. A few polite laughs. A few uneasy ones. Vanessa opened her clutch and produced the bills, 9 of them, each one $100, and held them out. Sing something, right now, and I'll give you this $9,000, and we'll find a way to take care of you and your mama. Consider it a donation to a worthy cause. The room was not laughing anymore. It was watching. Dorothy, who was standing near the kitchen entrance, had gone completely still. She had heard every word. She was 61 years old, and she had swallowed 1,000 small humiliations in this line of work because the job was steady and Douglas Hargrove was a decent man and the benefits were real. But she had never heard anyone speak about her daughter like that in public. Her hands were pressed flat against the tray she was holding. She didn't move. She was watching Camille. Camille set her tray down on the nearest table. She set it down slowly, deliberately, without making a sound. She smoothed the front of her blouse with both hands. She looked at Vanessa, then at the money, then back at Vanessa. And she said, quietly and clearly, "Keep your money." And she turned to walk away. Vanessa's voice came right behind her, faster this time, sharper. No, no, no. I mean it as a compliment. Unless you're not as talented as everyone says. She stepped around to block Camille's path. The room was completely silent now. Sing. or don't. But if you walk away, everyone here will know it's because you can't. That was the line. Not the money. Not the public spectacle. The suggestion that she couldn't. Camille stopped walking. She stood there for 3 full seconds that felt much longer. And then she turned back around to face the room. She didn't take the money. She didn't say a word. She just stood in the center of that ballroom, and she began to sing. She started with nothing. No piano, no accompaniment, no introduction. Just her voice in a room that had gone so quiet you could hear the ice shifting in the glasses. She sang A Change Is Gonna Come. Not a performance version. Not the arena version. The still, human version. The one that sounds like someone is telling you the most honest thing they have ever said. Her voice filled that ballroom from the floor to the ceiling. It was not loud. It was full. There is a difference, and every person in that room felt it the moment she opened her mouth. Women who had not expected to be moved that evening found themselves moved. Men who had been checking their phones put them down. Vanessa's smile had not disappeared, but it had changed in a way she didn't control. The door at the back of the ballroom opened at the second verse. Derek Hargrove had been in his father's study on the second floor for most of the evening, working through a deal that needed attention before Monday. He had heard the jazz quartet stop. He had heard the shift in crowd noise that happens when a room's energy changes, the way you feel it even through a floor. He had come down the back stairs and entered the ballroom through the rear door, and he had heard her voice before he saw her face. He stood at the back of the room, and he did not move for the entire length of that song. He watched the room the way he watched everything, carefully, without showing what he was taking in. He saw Vanessa at the front. He saw the bills still fanned in her hand. He saw his father, Douglas, standing near the fireplace with his hands folded, watching Camille sing with an expression Derek recognized as the one his father wore when something reminded him of why he had built everything he built. And Derek saw Camille, standing alone in the center of a room that had tried to diminish her, using the exact thing they'd meant to make her feel small as the platform to show everyone who she was. She finished the song. The room was silent for 2 full seconds after the last note. Then it broke open. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes out of people before they decide to give it. Vanessa began to clap too, measured and controlled, already calculating how to retake the room's attention. She stepped forward with the money still in her hand. "See?" she said, pitching her voice back up for the room. "I knew it. I told you she was good. So let's make good on the offer." She held the money out toward Camille, and that was the moment Derek walked from the back of the room to the front. Slowly, through 200 people who parted without being asked. He came to stand between Camille and Vanessa. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew who he was. He looked at the money in Vanessa's hand, and then he looked at Vanessa herself, and whatever he saw in her face settled something for him that he had been unsettled about for 14 months. He turned to Camille and he said, "I apologize for what happened here tonight." Not to the room. To her. Directly. Camille looked at him and said nothing, which was the correct response, because there was nothing she needed to say. Derek turned back to his guests and said, loud enough for the room, "This woman is not a performer hired for the evening. She is Dorothy's daughter, and Dorothy has been a part of this family for over 20 years. If anyone in this room thought what just happened was entertainment, I need you to correct that understanding right now." The room did not make a sound. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. He held it out to Camille and said, "I know someone at Lyric Opera. I know someone at Atlantic Records Chicago office. I know the head of artist development at a management firm on the Magnificent Mile. If you want any of those conversations, they're yours. No strings. No performance required." Camille took the card. She looked at it. She looked at him. And she said, "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. Nothing more." She picked up her tray, walked back toward the kitchen, and disappeared through the door. Derek turned to Vanessa. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform it for the crowd. He said it the way he said everything, low, direct, without decoration. "We need to talk." Vanessa kept her composure. She looked around the room quickly, reassessing, recalibrating, and she said with a careful smile, "Of course, baby." Later, Derek said, "Now." The room felt it. His mother, Loretta, who had been standing near the bar watching the whole sequence unfold, set down her glass. His father, Douglas, unfolded his hands and stood a little straighter. Vanessa's three friends exchanged a look that none of them would ever fully describe to other people, but all of them would remember. Derek and Vanessa walked out of the ballroom together and did not come back. What happened in his father's study, only two people know in full. What the guests saw was that 22 minutes later, Derek came back into the ballroom alone. He thanked the guests for coming. He said the evening had been a good one. He said the jazz quartet would play for another hour if anyone wanted to stay. He said nothing about Vanessa. He said nothing about the engagement. He didn't need to. The ring was gone from the display table near the entrance where Vanessa had placed it earlier in the evening as part of the decorative setup. Her own idea, her own touch, something Derek had never been fully comfortable with but had said nothing about. The table was empty. His mother caught his eye from across the room. He gave her the smallest nod. She turned and went to say goodbye to a guest, and that was that. Vanessa's driver was called. She left the Kenwood estate at 10:47 that evening. In the kitchen, Dorothy was sitting in a chair that one of the catering staff had quietly brought to her when they saw her hands shaking. Camille was beside her, not crying, not talking much, just present. One of the younger servers brought them both a glass of water. Dorothy held the glass in both hands and looked at her daughter and said, "You didn't have to sing." Camille said, "I know." Dorothy said, "Why did you?" Camille thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things before she answered. She said, "Because I didn't want her to think the reason I stopped was fear. I wanted her to know it was choice." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have said the same thing." Neither of them said anything else for a little while. 3 days later, Camille's phone rang. It was an assistant from a management firm on the Magnificent Mile. They said a Mr. Hargrove had passed along her information and that the director of artist development would like to schedule a meeting at her convenience. Camille sat down before she responded. She said she was available Thursday. They said Thursday worked perfectly and that they would confirm the address by email. She hung up and sat in the small kitchen of the apartment she shared with her mother and looked at the wall for a minute. Then she got up, filled the kettle, and put it on the stove. The meeting went for 2 hours. The director, a woman named Patricia who had been in the music industry for 30 years, told Camille plainly that she had a voice that could work in multiple markets and that the question was not whether there was a career, but what kind and on what timeline. She asked Camille what she wanted, not what she thought she could have, but what she actually wanted. Camille told her. Patricia wrote it down without reacting, which Camille took as a good sign. They scheduled a second meeting for the following week. Derek Hargrove did not pursue Camille. This needs to be said clearly, because the story doesn't work if that's where it goes. He had done what he did that evening not because of attraction, not because he was trying to build something, but because he had watched something wrong happen in his house, and he had the standing and the resources to correct it, and he had not hesitated. What he told himself afterward, in the quiet of his office the next morning, was that he had been hesitating for a long time about things he should have addressed, and the evening had simply made that visible in a way he couldn't manage around. He called his father that morning. They talked for an hour. About Vanessa, yes, but more than that. About what Derek wanted his life to actually look like, which was a conversation they had never directly had before. Douglas Hargrove said one thing that stayed with Derek. He said, "A woman who needs to make someone smaller to feel large enough, that's not a partner. That's a ceiling." He didn't say it loudly or dramatically. He just said it the way he said things, which was as a fact he had observed over 71 years that he was now passing along. Derek wrote it down after they hung up. He kept it. Vanessa Cole returned to Atlanta 3 weeks after the dinner. She gave one interview to a lifestyle publication in which she described the ending of the engagement as a mutual decision made with respect and care. The journalist, who had been in Chicago the week it happened and had heard a version of what happened at the dinner from 3 different guests, did not press her on the details. Vanessa was poised and precise through the whole thing. She always would be. That was both her strength and her limitation, and somewhere underneath the composure, on the nights she was honest with herself, she knew it. She had thought, when she held that money out in the ballroom, that she was being charming, that the room would see her as generous, playful, confident. She had read the room wrong. Not just Derek. She had read the room wrong entirely. She had looked at Camille and seen a prop, and what the room had actually seen was a woman who had everything Vanessa had worked to perform, except Camille had never performed it a day in her life. That is the thing you cannot recover from in a room full of people who know the difference. Camille signed with Patricia's management firm 4 months after the dinner. Her debut showcase was at a small venue in the South Loop. Nothing massive, nothing overstated. 80 seats, all full. Dorothy sat in the front row in a dress she had bought specifically for the evening. She had done her hair the way Camille liked it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and when her daughter walked onto that small stage, and the room went quiet in exactly the way rooms go quiet before something real is about to happen, Dorothy had decided beforehand that she would not cry. She lasted about 45 seconds into the first song before that plan collapsed entirely. Camille sang for an hour and 20 minutes. At the end of the set, she thanked the room, thanked Patricia, thanked her church choir director who had come down from the South Side, thanked the pianist. She didn't thank anyone dramatically or at great length. She was not a woman who lingered in the light. But at the very end, before she walked off stage, she looked at her mother and said, "This one's always been yours." And Dorothy, who had swallowed 1,000 things over 61 years and kept moving, sat in the front row of her daughter's first showcase and let herself feel all of it. Every last bit of it. Douglas Hargrove was at that showcase. He had not told anyone he was coming. He sat in the back with a guest, and he listened to the whole set. And when it was over, he found Dorothy near the exit, and he shook her hand and told her that she had raised a remarkable young woman. Dorothy thanked him. He said, "I should have done more years ago, and I didn't. I just want you to know I know that." Dorothy looked at him for a moment. She said, "You put that brochure under my door, Mr. Hargrove. That was something." He nodded. He said good night, and he left. Some stories ask you at the end who won. This one doesn't work that way. Vanessa didn't lose because she was destroyed. She lost the room the moment she decided a young woman in a server's uniform was something she could use, because the room, and Derek, and Douglas, and every person who was there that night, had already decided without announcing it that Camille was not a prop. Camille didn't win because someone handed her something. She stood in the center of a room that was designed to make her feel like nothing, and she showed it exactly what she was, and then she went back to the kitchen and got back to work. That is not a small thing. That is actually the whole thing. Dorothy still works at the Hargrove estate. She has cut back to 3 days a week. Camille covers the difference in the bills. They don't talk about the dinner very often, but sometimes, on Sunday afternoons when the light comes through the kitchen window at a certain angle and Camille is warming up her voice before church, Dorothy sits at the kitchen table with her coffee and she listens, and she does not say a word, and she does not need to. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel for more and share it with someone who needs it. And if you're somewhere in the middle right now, in the part that looks like an ending, keep building. The room you'll walk into one day doesn't exist yet, but it will. And when you arrive, you'll be ready.